The Old Testament is at the origin of a religion, Judaism. But the well-known stories contained in this book, which is also called the Hebrew Bible, also recount a history, that of the creation of the world and of the people of Israel. How much of this biblical text is history and how much is legend? Israel Finkelstein and Neil Silberman continue their investigations into the society that wrote the Old Testament. We meet up with them again in Megiddo. In previous episodes, they showed that the Bible's most famous stories, those of Abraham, the patriarchs, or the Exodus, when the ancient Israelites left Egypt, were first put into writing in the 7th century BC, in the heart of the Judahite Hills. It was here that most of the stories contained in the Bible were written down. They bring to life a complex antique world, full of noise and passion, of conflicts and alliances, of heroes and conquests. A story similar to that of all peoples, but one that in this case gave birth to a unique book. In this episode, we are going to explore the origins of the nation that first put the text of the Bible into writing. According to the biblical text, Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt to the land of Canaan, the Holy Land. We see them reconquer the lands of their ancestors and gradually become a sovereign people in their land.
The first verses of the book of Joshua say the following. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' minister, Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all these people, into the land which I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. This is the beginning of the great saga, the great epic of the conquest of Canaan in the book of Joshua. And the Bible tells the story step by step, from here to Jericho, from Jericho to Ai, from Ai to the war with the kings of the south, and then to Hatzor and the kings of the north. And it's a wonderful story, a great saga of war and conquest and bravery. And the question is, did it happen? Did it really happen the way it is described in the text of the Bible, of the book of Joshua?
The Bible describes Joshua primarily as a military leader who was given a mission by God to conquer the land that was promised to the patriarchs and then to Moses. Joshua invaded the territory of Canaan at the head of an enormous army of confederated Israelite tribes. He crossed the Jordan River and attacked and conquered the region's cities one after the other in a lightning war. These conquered cities formed the outlines of a country.
The biblical version presents this conquest as a sort of blitzkrieg. In all, it took 2 weeks, and practically the whole of the population was exterminated. No mercy was shown for the people of Canaan. But we are not told why. We are not told that it was because they worshipped false gods or because they were particularly evil. On the contrary, no reasons are given. What is important is that they were all devoted to destruction, according to the biblical text. The word used is harem, which means that everything must be destroyed in order to be given back to Yahweh. The idea is that God grants them victory, so everything therefore belongs to God.
The conquest followed by the dividing up of Canaan are at the heart of the biblical book of Joshua. According to biblical chronology, this incident occurred in the second half of the 13th century BC. Archaeologists have located and excavated most of the cities referred to in the story. It is therefore necessary to take a closer look at these excavations. The most important site for this part of our investigation is Hazor in Galilee. The Bible describes this as a high-ranking city, the head of all those kingdoms. The archaeological site is being examined by Amnon ben Tor of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is continuing a task that was begun in the 1950s by the famous archaeologist Yigael Yadin. Some of the remains discovered here are considered to be those of a palace and a temple destroyed in the 13th century BC by a violent conflagration.
And look at the destruction. We are in the entrance to the Hatzor palace of the late Bronze Age, or Canaanite Hatzor. Look at the signs of the destruction, which are to be found everywhere. Look at the melted mud brick. It takes 1300 degrees centigrade to melt a mud brick. Look at the intense heat marked all over the bricks. Look at the white here, which is also an effect of the fire. Look at the wood, the timber. All those signs of the violent destruction of the palace of Hatzor. Look at the cracked basalt stones. Look at this. Normal heat doesn't do this. Only a very, very intense fire. Look at what is happening on the walls. See the ashes, see the wood, signs of the timber here, on the walls. Wherever you look, wherever you go, same signs of destruction.
These layers of destruction appear to provide tangible evidence of the conquest of Canaan by the armies of Joshua. Given the mood of 1950s Israel just after the country's independence, this hypothesis supported the idea that the birth of a nation had to be preceded by a military conquest.
Joshua's destruction of Hazor, the great city of North Canaan referred to in the Bible, was a key step in the conquest of Galilee by the Israelites. Dr. Yadin and his colleagues are hoping to reach the lair where we find the destroyed city. In 3 seasons of excavations, they have already found the remains of a number of Israelite cities that were successively built on the ruins of previous cities. They have discovered precious relics that add to our knowledge of the story and of the way people lived in those times. The Hazor excavation, which will be completed next summer, adds an impressive new chapter to biblical research and to universal knowledge of ancient history, of the link between the Jewish people and the land of Israel.
There was a great enthusiasm for archaeology during this period by a country in search of history. Its leaders, David Ben-Gurion, who was at that time prime minister, and former military leaders such as Yigael Yadin or Moshe Dayan. the facts seem to speak for themselves. Similar remains of destruction were to be found in many of the country's archaeological sites. However, the accumulation of conflicting data over the past 50 years sowed the first seeds of doubt. We therefore have to go back to the beginning and re-examine site by site the foundations of the hypothesis of the conquest of the country by Joshua and his armies. It is necessary to refer to the text and the story of the conquest as it is related in the Bible, in particular its most famous battle, that of Jericho. An impressive amount of information is available in relation to Jericho. It is one of the most excavated sites of the Levant. Several expeditions have succeeded each other there since the beginning of the 20th century. How does the Bible tell the story of the capture of Jericho? Everyone is familiar with the method that was used to cause the walls of the city to come tumbling down, the famous trumpets of Jericho. Go round the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. When you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the walls of the city shall fall flat down. Basing themselves on the Bible, the first researchers believed that some of the remains that were discovered here were those of the city destroyed during the attack by the Israelite armies. But these ruins predate the 13th century BC. The archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon was the first to conclude that at the time suggested by the Bible, there were no walls in Jericho that needed tumbling down. At the time of the conquest of Canaan, Jericho was unoccupied. We therefore have to reconsider all of these elements from another perspective.
So this is not history in the simple sense, and the case of Jericho applies also for other places mentioned in the tradition of the conquest in the book of Joshua. Many of the cities mentioned were not inhabited at all in the late Bronze Age. There was nothing there.
There is another inconsistency. Archaeologists' examination of all the different sites that have been excavated show that the process of destruction was spread over almost a century. In contrast, the Bible refers to a very short-lived operation. While certain cities were indeed destroyed, they were not all destroyed at the same time. What to do now? We have to widen our point of view and take into account the geopolitical situation of the Levant during the same 13th century, and focus on the main player of the period, Egypt. Almost 400 cuneiform tablets dating from the 14th century BC have been discovered in Tel El Amarna in Middle Egypt. They include certain information about the region that we are concerned with. They consist of diplomatic correspondence sent to the pharaohs by the kings of the small city-states of Canaan. A reading of the correspondence shows that the city-states were vassals of Egypt during the relevant period. In fact, from the 15th century to the beginning of the 12th century BC, the land of Canaan was an Egyptian province. Egypt occupied the country, where it set up a network of strongholds. This has been confirmed by the archaeological excavations. One of those strongholds was excavated in the 1920s at Beth Shean, south of the Sea of Galilee. The Amarna letters and the archaeological excavations clearly show that Beth Shean, whose biblical mound dominates the Roman and Byzantine ruins, was an important Egyptian bastion between the 14th and mid-12th centuries.
To understand the way the Egyptians dominated completely the country and the countryside, you have to come here. To a residency like this, there was a strong garrison, there were scribes here, there were soldiers here, there were administrators here, and everything was under the control of the Egyptians, which means that 20 kilometers from here, 30 kilometers from here, if somebody wanted to take some sort of a major economic decision or a major political decision, he needed to come to Beth Shean to get the approval of the Egyptians. They were the masters of the countryside. According to the traditional biblical archaeology, the conquest took place in the late 13th century, in the time of Ramses II. And we have two problems here. The first one is that at that time, Beth Shean was a very strong Egyptian stronghold with soldiers, with the people that could have been dispatched from here to block any invasion of Canaan. And the second problem is that the Egyptians are still here about a century after the traditional date of the conquest. How can it be?
So, the archaeological excavations tell us that the conquest did not take place. However, two questions remain unanswered. How can we explain the evidence of destruction that has been found in many of the sites? And what meaning can we give to the list of supposedly conquered cities that are cited in the biblical text? Our investigation will shortly provide the answers.
So the book of Joshua is not history. It's a mythical description. And like the case of the patriarchs and the case of Exodus, it tells the story of the formative stage in the life of the nation. And as such, it is full of divine interventions, bravery, and miracles.
The biblical text tells how, at the request of Joshua, God would help the Israelites win their battle in an entirely miraculous way. He extended the day during the battle by ordering the sun to stand still on Gibeon and the moon to stop in the valley of Ajalon. And the biblical text goes on to say that there was no day like that before it or after it, that Yahweh listened to the voice of a man.
The Joshua epic is the start of a great story that ends up in a story of kingship. The book of Joshua is in fact the Bible's first installment of a story that would ultimately show why Israel chose a king, in the same way that other peoples had done. But it didn't happen overnight. Joshua already prefigures in the Bible as being slightly royal, as he is treated somewhat like a king. But after the story of Joshua, we find a book called the Book of Judges. They were charismatic leaders who arose during a period that was chaotic and anarchical, a period in which nothing was determined. There was no central power, and, quote, every man did that which was right in his own eyes, according to the formula used in the book. So the Book of Judges is used to show that it is not possible to organize a nation in the absence of a king or central power. The Book of Judges ends on that finding. It is followed by the story of Samuel, which is the introduction to the history of kingship. Samuel would be the one to choose first Saul and then David as the king of Israel.
David. The biblical text presents David as a herder who was anointed by God. Hence the word Mashiach, or Messiah in Hebrew, the Anointed One. But did David really exist? Many doubt it. An inscription discovered at Tel Dan provides the answer. It refers to a king of Damascus whose defeated enemies included Ahaziah, king of the house of David.
So this is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, proof for the historicity of David. There was a David. The question is not whether there was a David or there was no David. The question is whether the kingdom of David was a great empire.
The Bible clearly refers to an empire, which it describes as a huge territory with Jerusalem at its center. With much ceremony, King David transferred the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and thereby made it the capital of the kingdom. Therefore, King David really did exist. There is no doubt about it. He reigned in the 10th century BC. But was his kingdom the vast empire described in the Bible? Our investigation will continue in Jerusalem, the city of David, as it is referred to in the biblical text. Jerusalem is an unusual city, which has been destroyed and rebuilt many times. It is a living city, a difficult terrain for archaeologists. Is it still possible to find signs of David's capital? Given the difficulties, archaeologists have to proceed by going back in time. They begin with the latest remains, those that have been reliably dated, and go back to the older ones whose chronology is still uncertain. This time, our investigation will take us to cemeteries from the end of the monarchical period, which were built outside the city. Israel Finkelstein is going to try to find the remains of the Jerusalem of the 7th century BC.
Well, I haven't been here for 20 years. I don't remember how to pass anymore. It's somewhere over there. Should be. That's okay. During the Iron Age, the time of this cemetery, people buried, the dead were buried outside of the limits of the city. So by plotting the layout of the cemeteries in Jerusalem, what you get, in fact, is some sort of a circle around an empty area with no tombs, and that empty area, the negative print with no tombs in the center, is in fact the area of the city in the Iron Age.
Localizing these necropoli enables a map to be drawn up of the contours of Jerusalem at the end of the 8th and during the 7th centuries, the time of kings Hezekiah and Josiah. But this large city is the late Jerusalem, from the time when Judah was a prosperous state. What about David's city, which is 2 centuries older? The city that we are looking for has to be somewhere within these contours. Our investigation will focus on the ridge called Ir David, to the south of Temple Mount. It is here that archaeologists have been looking for King David's capital since the 19th century.
We are standing on the upper slope, on the upper part of the slope down to the valley of Kidron. In the lower part, we see 2 or 2.5 houses from the late Iron Age. And above the houses is this very strange, I think, what we call the step structure. These are not steps to climb up a slope. This is just a revetment, a cover of a slope which is very loose, which is made of debris, which might, in a little earthquake or so, collapse down the slope and take with them whatever is standing above them. In the late Bronze Age and in the early Iron Age, there is human activity here. There's human occupation here on a very small scale.
The way I see it, there was a village here in the 10th century, but it was a small one, mainly on this part of the ridge of the city of David, not along the ridge, not all along the ridge, with a very limited population, not fortified, and with no monuments.
Well, I agree. I agree that it was a very small place. Iron Age Jerusalem was a very small, and this does not agree, or archaeology and text describe 2 different natures of sites, not the existence, but the natures of the sites.
Unlike the great city of the 7th century, David's Jerusalem was a simple mountain village covering 3 to 4 hectares. We can agree that David did not build a prestigious capital. In the Bible, he is above all described as a conqueror. But what about his son, the illustrious Solomon, whom the Bible tells us was a great builder?
The biblical story of Solomon reads a bit like a story from the Arabian Nights. Solomon is the wise king par excellence, he of the famous judgment of Solomon. But he was also someone who was so famous that even the Queen of Sheba came to visit him, to meet with the man whose wisdom was talked about even in far-flung Africa. Solomon's empire is said to have been so enormous that no other empire could compete. And Solomon was also the builder of the temple, which allowed the God of Israel to find a resting place within Israel.
Discovering the Temple of Solomon, an impossible task today. Religious sensitivities, in particular in respect of the Temple Mount, preclude the investigation of certain areas. We therefore have to look for clues in the bowels of the city of David.
You see, we are standing inside what is left of the Middle Bronze Age fortifications, and you can see how high they still stand, 3,700 years. Part is destroyed, but part survived, and the lower parts are even better preserved.
What's amazing is the size of the stone. Some of them are a few tons in weight, right?
Yeah, these two stones, for example, reach, let's say, 2 to 3 tons each.
And what's interesting here, all these talks that, because we are in Jerusalem, monuments could have been simply eradicated by later builders, robbed and so on and so forth. Here we see that this is impossible. When you have a monument like this, something remains.
Any big building from any period of time left after it, whether destroyed by nature or destroyed by man, in one way or another, parts standing and parts in a state of collapse. You must find something.
Like David's Jerusalem, Solomon's capital was an insignificant village. But what about the rest of the kingdom? In the 1960s, the archaeologist Yigael Yadin undertook excavations in Megiddo, one of our books of stone. Before him, in the 1920s and 30s, the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago had already carried out a thorough campaign of excavations, during which the remains of a gate to the city were discovered. This gate, of which only one side remains, has an unusual design. It is a pathway that is framed on each side by 3 chambers. It is therefore known as a 6-chambered gate. Yigael Yadin did not choose Megiddo by chance. His previous excavations at the Hazor site resulted in the discovery of a similar gate. Yadin then turned to another site, that of Gezer. This time, he only went so far as to consult the report of an archaeologist who explored the site at the beginning of the 20th century. Yadin discovered a similar gate in the design for a later small fort. A gate that was similar in design and size to those of Megiddo and Hazor. For Yigael Yadin, the conclusion was obvious. Megiddo, Gezer, and Hazor all carried the signs of the same architect, King Solomon. Yigael Yadin was guided in his investigation by a biblical verse. The verse tells us that Solomon raised a levy to build the house of Yahweh, and his own house, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer. So, Solomon was a builder king at the head of an empire. When writing about David and Solomon, the Bible serves as a history book. But once again, reality proves to be slightly more complicated. Recent stratigraphic investigation has shown that the Megiddo Gate was built after the Hazor one. It has also been shown that this type of gate was already in existence in the 8th century. Israel Finkelstein is troubled by these inconsistencies. Everything has to be reconsidered. A new chronology based on scientific procedures will have to be determined for the strata and monumental vestiges. Archaeological methods have evolved since the excavations led by Yigael Yadin. Carbon-14 dating techniques are more and more accurate. The margin of error has been reduced to 30 to 50 years. Organic samples are therefore taken from the layers of destruction in many sites, including Megiddo. They include seeds and olive stones, which allow for a more reliable dating due to their more limited life cycles. The exact sciences, physics, chemistry, statistics, are brought into play. The results provide a drastic reversal of everything we ever knew about David and Solomon and their times.
So here's the situation. If we have the Mound of Megiddo, and we partition it into conventional and low chronology, okay, with the two strata. This one was supposed to be in the 11th century BC, and now according to the radiocarbon results, we definitely see that this is impossible, that it falls into the 10th century. And the meaning is that the stratum which had been dated to the 10th century cannot be 10th century, it goes to the 9th century BC.
That is, a whole century after Solomon. A set of certitudes based on deductions have collapsed. The pieces of the puzzle no longer fit together. After our reconsideration of David's empire, it is now Solomon's turn.
What is the situation with the 10th century now?
It's confusing. In Jerusalem, it's a small village, nothing monumental, no real evidence for big capital.
Despite the biblical evidence.
Of course, no evidence for a great Solomonic capital ruling over a great state, rich state, and so on. And here at Megiddo, the buildings, the monumental buildings which had been described as the symbol of Solomonic greatness, in fact, date a bit later. They don't date to the time of Solomon, they don't date to the 10th century. So we are in a situation of a complete negative picture, negative evidence from coast to coast.
And yet there are magnificent buildings here. And the question is, what kingdom were they related?
Yeah, they are dated a bit later, I think, but the question again is what's going on in the 10th century?
We have a real historical problem here. We have to come up with a new explanation.
As often happens in such cases, just as uncertainties reach their climax, a new clue is discovered. Norma Franklin has been part of the Megiddo expedition for years. She noticed that the stonework of a palace that Yadin attributed to Solomon displayed very unusual mason's marks. She looked through the records and reports of old excavations to find out if similar masons' marks were to be found elsewhere. She found that such masons' marks were only recorded in one other building, only one building in the whole country. The building is to be found in Samaria, a city located in a mountainous region. Like Megiddo, this site is one of the wonders of the Kingdom of Israel. The solution to our enigmas lies here, amongst these verdant hills. Samaria was excavated on 2 occasions last century. Many remnants from the Roman era were found from a time when the city was called Sebastia. It was built by a king named Omri in the 9th century BC and was the capital of the Kingdom of Israel. Vast monuments that were built by this king and his descendants have been found here. The Bible considers the Omri dynasty as debauched and renegade kings, the infamous cursed kings. But sources outside the Bible provide another image altogether. Omri's son Ahab is seen as being a great monarch. The missing piece of the puzzle appears to have been found.
When we come to Samaria and we see the monumental building, palace is built by Omri, it's so out of keeping with what we have been told, that the Omride kingdom was the breakaway kingdom, it was a small kingdom. In fact, it's quite different. We can visibly see that we're dealing with a monumental building, a building that needed a strong and powerful king in order to establish it. So this is telling us that we cannot just follow the biblical account. We have to look around us and see what else we have from the same time period. Everything is telling us that we're dealing with a strong and powerful king, a king who had at his fingertips the resources to build an incredible palace. So we're looking at a very powerful kingdom, a very strong king.
What places like Samaria and Megiddo tell us when we look at the palaces at those places is very clear. That the kingdom which was the richest and the strongest and the best connected internationally was the northern kingdom, Israel, while Judah to the south was small, poor, and marginal.
These conclusions are quite surprising. The sister kingdom to the north, Israel, with its rich soils and its temperate climate, was prosperous and developed. Whereas the kingdom to the south, Judah, with its rocky hills and its tiny population, only developed as far as a subsistence economy. They both share the land of Canaan. One was strong, the other was weak. And yet it was the weak kingdom, the younger sibling Judah, that would write the family history and would credit itself with the successes of the great kings of the north.
When you read the history of these 2 kingdoms, Israel and Judah, in the Bible, you soon realize that the kings of the north lag way behind in the stakes. Each king is evaluated, and regardless of what the northern kings do, they always obtain a very poor rating. quite simply because the story is written from a southern perspective. That is, the kings are always judged from the perspective that Jerusalem is the only legitimate sanctuary. The kings of the north therefore have no chance of obtaining a good rating in the Book of Kings.
How can we explain such a paradoxical situation? History provides the answer. In the 8th century, Assyrian ambitions destroyed the dreams of the kingdom of the north. The kingdom of Israel was swept from the map, and Judah remained alone to defend the Israelite heritage. Jerusalem became the city where all of this would be played out. We are now at the end of the 7th century BC. A young king, Josiah, that we have learnt by now, reigns in Judah. He has the mission of conquering the territories of the lost kingdom of Israel. He believes he has both the means to succeed and the duty. The Assyrian Empire was in decline. All of its efforts were focused on problems that had arisen in the northeast.
The dream of a united Israel was not possible to fulfill as long as the Assyrian Empire was there. But when the Assyrians pull out, things become possible. And Josiah, king of Judah, embarks on this great idea, great adventure. He plans to take over the territories of the now destroyed northern kingdom. And by doing that, he plans to reunify the people of Israel, all of them, under one king of the lineage of David in Jerusalem. And here the story of the book of Joshua, the conquest of Joshua, and the story of the great empire of David and Solomon play an important role, because the conquest of Joshua delineates the territories that Josiah wishes to take over. And the great empire of David and Solomon gives the model for the great Israelite empire to come.
We are almost at the end of this story. The biblical saga of the conquest, written in the past tense, provides a promise for the future, an ideal. Joshua's conquest is in fact the conquest that Josiah hoped to achieve.
So while Josiah's story in the Bible is quite brief, there is no doubt at all that the narrator wants to present him as the new David. From the very beginning of the story, we read that Josiah did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, and later that he walked in the ways of David, his father, and didn't turn aside to the right hand or to the left. It will be shown, in fact, that in all that he did, he was the worthy successor to the founder of the dynasty, leaving the reader with no other conclusion other than we are dealing with a new David.
According to the Bible, the divine commitment to the dynasty of David was an unconditional one. That promise, recorded in the biblical text, makes the mission of his descendant, Josiah, an inescapable one. Its plan is the realization of that promise. But once again, the tides of fate decided otherwise. A tragedy was in the making at Megiddo. Egypt, which had been forgotten about, came back on the scene with a vengeance. Pharaoh Necho II summoned Josiah and killed him.
The death of Josiah completely changed the concept of the Messiah. Up until the time of Josiah, all the successors to David were known as the Mashiach, the Anointed One. And this was really a symbol of their legitimate succession to the throne of Judah. But with the death of Josiah, everything changed. All the promises that had been believed to be embodied in Josiah were suddenly disproved by events. The death of Josiah caused a huge change in the idea of a transformation from royal succession to a future hope.
For the peoples of antiquity, the idea that the time to come could be better than what they lived on a daily basis, that history has a meaning and an end, was a new concept. Today, this faith in messianic times is at the core of the Jewish liturgy. A king of the house of David will one day come to realize Josiah's dream, an earthly kingdom that will carry out the divine mission. David, King of Israel, lives forever. This creed has generated an unbreakable form of hope. It is the third pillar of Judaism. In the next and last episode, we will explore the origins of the Israelites and try to understand how a collection of different stories were transformed into a single book, the Bible. Over the centuries, the Bible's remarkable stories have formed the basis of monotheism. In previous episodes, we saw the role played by the patriarchs and by the Exodus and the Law. Questions were raised about Joshua's conquest of Canaan, and the importance of King David and King Solomon was reconsidered. This time, our archaeological quest is aimed at establishing the origins of a people. Who is this people that the Bible calls the children of Israel? Where did they come from? Our archaeological investigation is going to take us on the path of another Genesis, that of the authors of a book that formed the basis of one religion, Judaism, and then went on to inspire two others, Christianity and Islam, the three religions devoted to a single God. Tel Megiddo. This archaeological site will once again provide some keys to the authors of the Bible. The 25 strata found at the site cover 7,000 years of the history of Canaan. Will it allow us to find clues to the origins of the Israelites? Our two investigators, Israel Finkelstein and Neil Silberman, are writing a book that uses archaeological tools to re-examine the Bible's stories. The issue of the origin of the Israelites is at the heart of their investigation. In previous episodes, it was shown that the Exodus, the flight from Egypt, had left no trace, and that the land of Canaan was never conquered in military terms. So where do the Israelites come from? What approach should we take to our investigation? The Museum of Cairo contains a stele that describes a military campaign led by Pharaoh Merneptah against Canaan. It contains a crucial piece of information.
The princes are prostrate, saying mercy. Plundered is Canaan with every evil. Carried off is Ashkelon. Seized upon is Gezir. Yanoam is made as that which does not exist. Israel is destroyed, and its seed is no more. All lands together they are pacified. The only indication that the Merneptah stele provides as to the nature of this population named Israel is that the hieroglyphics contain the symbols for man and woman, and the three lines indicating a plural. In other words, it refers to a semi-nomadic group that has not settled down, that does not live in a city. It's a group that moves around without a particular territory, and that is all we know.
The stele dates from the very end of the 13th century, 1207 BC, a concrete starting point in our quest for the people of Israel. Historians tell us that at the time the stele was erected, Canaan was organized around city-states under the domination of Egypt. In the strata of the Megiddo site corresponding to this period, the remains of a flourishing city have been found. During the whole of the 13th and 14th centuries, Megiddo was apparently a prosperous Canaan city, but suddenly, in around 1130 BC, it was destroyed. A layer of carbonized debris that is clearly visible in many areas of the site attests to the violence of the event that caused this destruction.
Megiddo is only one piece of evidence in a much bigger picture of the destruction of Canaanite culture. Other places were also put to the torch: Hatzor, Lachish, Bethel, and Megiddo. However, not in the same time. Some of them came down in the 13th century. Others survived a little bit. Some of them were destroyed in the 12th century BC. It took about a century until all of them were put to the torch. Who did it then? And why?
If we broaden our perspective, we can see that the entire Levant region underwent an intensely troubled period at the time. Egypt was no longer the power of bygone days and had lost its far-off colonies one by one. the Hittites, who controlled Asia Minor and the north of Syria, disappeared, as did the Mycenaean civilization and its monuments. As for the Levant city-states, they were swept away. The Canaan landscape was radically transformed. How did this happen? Cuneiform tablets discovered in the port city of Ugarit in Syria, which was itself destroyed at the time, provide the first elements of an explanation. These texts attest to a climate of fear and confusion. When deciphered, they provide evidence of the causes of this upheaval. Amurapi, the last king of Ugarit, wrote to the king of Arashia, today's Cyprus, "Father, the enemy's ships have come, burning our cities and sowing destruction everywhere." Which formidable enemy was capable of overturning the ancient world in this way? Who were these invaders who came from the sea? The archaeologist Ayelet Gilboa is excavating a site on the north coast of Tel Aviv. She puts forward the explanation that is most widely accepted by the experts.
One of the main, probably, outcomes are what we call the movements of the sea peoples, which are still, after about 100 years of research, a very mysterious group of people. Most people think that they came from somewhere in the west, maybe Greece, maybe Anatolia, which is west to us, possibly Cyprus, and settled in our region on the coast of the Levant. Now, among these people, the most celebrated, the most famous ones are the Philistines. We all know the Philistines from the Bible. But there were many groups of sea people. We know them name by name from the Egyptian records, mainly from the Egyptian records, from some Canaanite records too. Among them, again, there were many, but were such people as Sikila, Shardana, Luka, Ekwesh, and many other names, which are very hard to define archaeologically.
What can we learn from the Canaan and Egyptian sources? In Medinet Habu in Upper Egypt, a monumental inscription dating from Ramses III describes attacks carried out by unknown invaders. The carvings show a military campaign and a naval battle, capsized boats, archers, men fallen into the sea. Egypt's adversaries are clearly depicted. They are wearing plumed helmets with chin straps and sometimes strange horned helmets, a visual account of the horrors of a battle. In less than 1 century, the 12th, the Sea Peoples occupied the entire coast.
It would be a mistake to understand every single destruction of a Canaanite city-state as a result of an attack by the Sea People. The entire Eastern Mediterranean was in a complete turmoil. The economy was disrupted. Maritime trade routes were cut. Ports on the Mediterranean coast were destroyed, were attacked and taken. In a situation like this of economy falling, famine, political dysfunction, then one city can attack another. A gang of people from the highlands can take a city. Pastoral nomads can come also and try to gain some advantage by attacking a single city, isolated city. Everything was in chaos.
While the city-states were collapsing one by one, another development was secretly unfolding in the highlands. At the time, the population density of the region was quite low. Its barren topography made communications difficult. It was an enclosed area, ideal for a genesis or birth. Up until the end of the 1960s, the highlands were practically terra incognita in archaeological terms. After the 1967 war, these territories were placed under Israeli administration. Exploratory missions were then carried out at the surface level by a number of archaeological teams. Researchers went over the territory, square meter by square meter, carrying out a meticulous collection at ground level of any traces of human passage or settlement. The slightest object of significance was collected and its location noted. A task that required observation, sorting, and classification, followed by analysis. Certain sites were then chosen for excavation. This type of research is based on statistical methodology. The location of remains and concentrations of fragments are transferred onto a map of the area. This enables a reconstruction of how a given territory was occupied, the size of sites, their number, and their evolution over time. In this way, the highlands were inspected with a fine-toothed comb. The results were amazing. Between the 12th and 10th centuries BC, almost 250 villages were to be found in the highlands of central Canaan. This occurred without the slightest trace of a military conquest. It was a social transformation that was gradual, but nevertheless radical.
So what we see here is the map, the entire map of all the surveys of many years in the highlands from south to north. This map itself is extremely important, but there is one more step to take, and that is to show, to investigate this map on the background vis-a-vis the map of the period before and the map of the period after, and then you see the process. And this is really what's amazing, because in the late Bronze, it's very, very sparse. There are very few settlements. Altogether, in the highlands, maybe 30 or so. And then during a very short period of time, you have a wave of settlement with about 250 sites all over the area. And this is really the rise of early Israel.
Why can we call them the first Israelites? What characterizes this population which appeared in the highlands? The layout of their villages, which is very different from villages in the lowlands, provides a first clue. These villages were oval in shape. Animal husbandry was the principal activity of the inhabitants. A completely enclosed area was used to corral herds and protect them during the night. But why were these villages oval? This configuration is similar to that of the Bedouins described by the first explorers who entered the Judean and Transjordan deserts. Were the inhabitants of the highlands former pastoral nomads? Did they exchange their tents for permanent shelters? And if so, why? Israel Finkelstein finally seems to have identified a lead in his investigation of the origins of the Israelites. But in order to go further, he has to take into account ethnographic and ethnoarchaeological data drawn from an observation of the Bedouins' current way of life.
حياك الله في وادي رم. درينك تي بدوين.
Thank you.
لو سهلا تفضل.
شكرا.
عفوا.
شكرا.
The nomad's livelihood depends on a system of exchange with sedentary populations, a system that is based on certain rules. The pastoralists provide animal protein and leather, while the settled population provides cereals and other agricultural products. Cereals form the basis of the diet of traditional societies, including those of nomadic herders. Without these grains, the Bedouins would not be able to continue their nomadic way of life. If, for whatever reason, the exchange system collapses or becomes impossible, the Bedouins would be forced to produce their own grain. But in order to do so, they would first have to settle down. What caused the collapse of the exchange system and forced the pastoral nomads to settle down in the highlands?
Remember that in the last phase of the late Bronze Age, we are entering slowly a major crisis in the entire region. Canaan, the neighboring lands, the entire Eastern Mediterranean is in a severe crisis. Empires collapse, cities are destroyed, the Egyptian administration is gone from Canaan. People are running away from the villages. In a situation like this, the villagers cannot produce enough grain for the exchange with the pastoral nomads, and the pastoral nomads have to settle down. This is exactly the moment when we see all of a sudden a wave of settlement in the highlands. In my opinion, these are the pastoral people of the late Bronze Age who now settle down because of this crisis.
Archaeology shows us that the material culture of the pastoral nomads who settled down in the highlands was not very different from that of neighboring peoples, except for one particularity that distinguishes them: their diet. In all the archaeological excavations of the highlands, no pork bones have ever been found. What can this mean? What reasons can we find to explain this oddity?
There are several reasons, possible reasons. One is that if these people came from pastoral background, of course the pastoral people do not have pigs, and this could have been one of the reasons. But I think that there is a stronger reason to the fact that there are no bones of pigs in the highlands, and that is that at the same time exactly you have the sites of the Philistines in the lowlands, and in general the sites in the lowlands, Canaanites, Philistines and others, they have a lot of, they eat a lot of pork. So the distinction between the people of the lowlands and the people of the highlands could have been a situation of we and they. They eat pork, we don't.
But that's not all. The highlands, where a population that abstained from eating pork settled, were not a homogeneous territory. In the south, vegetation was scarce and rainfall uncertain. The arid soil prevented any real development of agriculture. The environment in the north was quite different. More abundant water sources and fertile valleys meant that a cereal-based agriculture was able to develop. Not only cereals, but also olive trees and grapevines. The many remains of presses that have been found in the area provide evidence of a developed agricultural system and one of the most lucrative of activities, the production of oil and wine. The villages situated on these trading routes became more and more wealthy and developed into cities. Two different ecosystems explain the emergence of these two distinct entities. One in the north, which would become the Kingdom of Israel, and the other in the south, which would become the Kingdom of Judah. Archaeology has searched in vain for a trace of the unified kingdom of David and Solomon as described in the Bible. Did such a kingdom ever exist? Neil Silberman and Israel Finkelstein have analyzed the data from remains found in Canaan and in bordering regions. Two inscriptions in particular have shed light on the subject. The Mesha stele, on display in the Louvre, was discovered by an Alsatian missionary in South Jordan in 1868. The inscription advises that it was erected by King Mesha of Moab in order to thank the god Chemosh for a victory against the Kingdom of Israel. This stele contains the name of Omri, king of Israel. It dates from the 9th century BC. Another stele from the same period was discovered in 1993 in the north of Israel. It states that King Hazael of Damascus killed the king of Israel, Jehoram, and the king of Judah, Ahaziah, of the house of David. These inscriptions clearly distinguish between two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. There is no mention of a single kingdom. Nevertheless, the Bible attributes a common religion to these two kingdoms, that of Yahweh. What do we know about this religion? It is difficult to reconstitute the vision that a people had of their gods through archaeology. Difficult, but not impossible. Excavations carried out in different sites in both the north and the south have unearthed a range of objects of worship. Fertility goddesses, companions of gods, and animal incarnations of the divinities. They are to be found both in Canaanite sites from the Bronze Age and in sites from the Israelite era in the Iron Age.
We have very, very little information about the religion. One of them I published, I found once in a kibbutz in Galilee, not far from here, Kibbutz Shamir. I visited and I found on a shelf there a bronze figure of a bull. And I asked where this bull was found. It's very nice. It's about 18 centimeters long, beautiful bull. They said a member of the kibbutz, he was a soldier, he was in training in the northern Samaria hills. He found it on a hill. The bull is the symbol, of course, of Baal, the god, the main god of Canaan, and also of El, the chief god, you know, the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. But also is related to the Israelite god, especially in the northern part of the country. The bull, you know, the golden calves, they are the major symbols of the temples of Dan and Bethel during the Israelite period. There is a lot of continuity between Canaanite and Israelite religion.
What do we know about Yahweh? Certain biblical verses refer to a god from the southern desert, worshipped with more or less the same fervor in the north and the south. How well did Yahweh, the god of the south, and El, or Baal, gods from the north, coexist? Quite well if we go by the evidence of remains found throughout the land. However, the Bible refers to a conflict. The well-known incident of the golden calf that occurred when Moses went up Mount Sinai to receive the tablets of the law from Yahweh. While Moses was going up to the mountaintop, the people waiting in the valley made a golden calf. As in other similar passages in the Old Testament, the idol was ultimately destroyed and Yahweh triumphed. What did this conflict between divinities and this victory of Yahweh represent? What historical reality did it reflect? Is there archaeological evidence for the existence of the worship of Yahweh in the kingdom of Judah? In the Museum of Israel in Jerusalem, we can see two amulets dating from about 600 BC, discovered southwest of the old city of Jerusalem. These pieces are covered in an archaic Hebrew text which says, "May Yahweh bless and keep you. May Yahweh shine his face upon you." It is the oldest text ever discovered that is similar to a biblical verse.
It's clear that Yahweh was the national god. Yahweh was worshipped like a national god, just as the Ammonites worshipped Milcom. The Moabites worshipped Chemosh, and so on. But worshipping a national god does not exclude the worship of other divinities. On the contrary, the national god is important for the protection of the people in leading the king and his people to war. But when it comes to matters of fertility, for example, or storms, other gods can be called on. For fertility, it's primarily goddesses. You have to imagine that in Judah, there was a small pantheon surrounding Yahweh, which was also undoubtedly the case in Israel.
Let us now review the situation. In 722 BC, Assyrian armies annihilated the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of the north, causing an influx of refugees into Judah. At the same time, Judah's economy was developing, and this small kingdom became a genuine state. 1 century after the fall of the kingdom of Israel, the king of Judah, Josiah, took advantage of the decline of the Assyrian Empire to envisage the conquest of the territories in the north. The refugees from the kingdom of the north brought with them their traditions and religions. However, Josiah's plan was based on a united people, a single nation. Josiah's plan was carried out in steps. First of all, he discovered a book that was attributed to Moses and united the population around the laws it contained. Leaving aside the historicity of this event, it is believed that the book in question was the 5th book of the Bible, Deuteronomy.
One of the most important ideas in the book of Deuteronomy is the idea of the centralization of the cult. And it says that all the people of Israel must worship one God and one God only in one place. So it's one nation worshiping one God in a single temple.
The second step of the reform involved eradicating any competing religions in order to unite the people around a single God. Finally, the third step involved elaborating a common history by combining the traditions of the North with those of the South. Is it possible to find traces in the field of Josiah's reform, proof that this centralization of religion in Jerusalem occurred? The Temple of Arad in the Negev, constructed in the 8th century BC, is located inside a fortress. The temple was destroyed at the end of the 8th century and was never rebuilt. It was constructed on the model of temples that had been erected in Canaan for centuries, a model going back to the late Bronze Age. In the internal courtyard, which was open to the public, we find the sacrificial area. The courtyard gives on to a sanctuary reserved for priests only. Beyond that, the Holy of Holies, with 2 altars and 2 vertical stones representing what the Bible enigmatically calls the Matzevah. This temple is a place of worship like those that existed outside of Jerusalem in the 8th century.
If what we think about this temple is correct, we have a very interesting situation of a difference between the 8th and 7th centuries BC. In the 8th century, we have temples in various places in Judah, including this one of Arad behind me, Beersheba, which is not far from here, and other places. Whereas in the 7th century, they all disappear. And we have the temple in Jerusalem.
The Bible sets out Josiah's declaration to the elders of Judah and of Jerusalem. We will now turn to one element of the story, which is based on a book.
The fact that they said a book had been found, which means that it was an ancient book that was lost somewhere in the temple, obviously legitimated the reform. But at the same time, it also shows that the redefinition of the Judaite religion was now going to be based on a book. The book was going to become the basis of a new religion. So it's not just the fact that a book was found, but there's the whole issue of the status and importance of that book, which it didn't have before.
In order to pursue our investigation, we have to examine a central question, that of writing. What do we know about the beginnings of writing in this region? In which circumstances did writing become important in the society of ancient Israel? Did the Israelites know how to read and write in the 7th century BC? Here again, we have to look to archaeology for the answers. In the 7th century sites, we have discovered many seals and ostraka, fragments of pottery that contain inscriptions. In the 8th century, they are very rare. Before that, they are quite simply non-existent. These brief texts deal with economic or administrative questions. Written by scribes, they provide evidence of the development and centralization of Judah, which was then an Assyrian vassal. This corresponds to a well-known phenomenon. The emergence of a state is generally accompanied by the spread of writing. In an Ostrakhan of the 7th century, a laborer complains to the authorities about the theft of a garment. In what way does this text provide proof of a revolution?
Before the 7th century BC, it's clear that the ancient Israelites were not literate. As a matter of fact, what we would say is that literacy wasn't even a category that people thought about. It wasn't an important idea in society. Beginning in the 7th century, writing spreads through all classes of Israelite society. We see writing by tomb cutters, by officers in the army, by workmen. A variety of different kinds of people throughout society are writing and apparently reading as well. And the spread of writing in ancient Israel at this time indicates that writing at least had a beginnings of literacy in Israel. And of course, this beginnings of literacy will be critical to the emergence of a sacred, written, and authoritative text.
Writing had just expanded beyond the circle of scribes. Of course, public readings of the book discovered in the temple do not prove the degree of literacy of the population of Judah. But they do show the function that the written word had attained in 7th century society. In the small state of Judah, under the reign of Josiah, a revolution had been launched.
The fact that a sacred written text emerged from a pastoral agrarian society is a watershed of Western civilization. Never before in human history had societies had sacred texts that were authoritative. Most Near Eastern civilizations had texts only for governments, for writing. Authority, cultural authority, religious authority was passed from family to family through oral tradition. It wasn't passed by reading texts or appealing to the authority of text. The first time in human history that we have the authority of human texts is with the Josianic religious reforms, where they appeal to the authority of a written text and have that written text as a binding authority for the entire culture, for all people, as opposed to the authority of the family and the tradition. And this is a watershed of Western civilization.
In the 7th century BC, everything merges. Everything is ripe for something new. When we look at the politics of the time, the economy of the time, the social situation in Judah, even the fact that literacy spreads from the center to the countryside, to the villages, to the relatively simple people, what we see is a situation in which Judah puts everything in the written word, in a book. Judah describes its past, mythical or historical. It tells us about the present, and it gives us the dreams for the future in the shape of the written word, of a book. And this is something new in the history of the human adventure.
Based on this legitimacy founded on a common law and history, Josiah was able to lead the population in his ambitious plan. But the dream of a great kingdom that would unite the people of Israel and Judah for the first time ever was not to be. Josiah died before he was able to accomplish it, killed by Pharaoh Necho II. His end is related in the Bible in a few lines. And the worst was yet to come. In 597 BC, the Babylonians wreaked havoc in the kingdom of Judah for the first time. "11 years later, Nebuchadnezzar marched on Jerusalem. The temple of Yahweh was burned down. Jerusalem was laid to ruins. Judah was erased from the map. A significant portion of the rural population was maintained in Judah under the yoke of Babylonia. In line with imperial policy, some of the inhabitants were exiled to Babylon. The last king of the house of David, Zedekiah, was also exiled, his sons slaughtered. The elite of the cities, the priests and the scribes, were banished to the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. The book of Psalms laments that, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept.
The situation of exile is in fact a situation of huge crisis because all the pillars on which the identity of a people were based no longer existed. There was no more temple, there was no more king, there was no more country, there was no more territorial unity. So in order to survive, it was necessary to find other means of constructing an identity. It was in fact those who were exiled, the scribes, the priests, who constructed that identity, taking up a certain number of earlier traditions, but opening those traditions out. That is, Josiah's reform would become the symbol of the temple which was transformed into a synagogue. Little by little, Moses would replace the king, and the Torah would replace the country. Through this work of writing and rewriting, Judaism would be invented in the concrete form that it took during the Persian era, notably under Ezra the priest.
Biblical scholars have therefore suggested that the scribe Ezra gave the final touches to the Torah, the Pentateuch. We are approaching our conclusion. What have we learned from the evidence provided by the mounds, the broken vases, and the ancient inscriptions? We are at the theology department of the University of Lausanne. Israel Finkelstein is going to meet with Thomas Romer. The time when archaeologists took the Bible literally and when textual research ignored material evidence is past.
2 Samuel 21. In 2 Samuel and for you, has, you know, these new revelations of archaeology, have they changed something?
I think we have to distinguish between the final form of the Bible, which has become the basis not only of Judaism, but for the three monotheistic religions, and the origins of the Hebrew Bible. What I think is important is this question of origins. It's no longer about the wanderings of Abraham or David. The most significant change is the realization that there was a political will at work at the origins. Let me turn your question around. How do you see the Hebrew Bible? How would you define it?
In a way, I started feeling closer to the authors of the text because I sensed more their needs and their frustrations and their the problems that they faced and so on. So first of all, I would say that I feel closer to the text, and it gave me a better sense of my own identity, both as an Israeli and as a Jew, and also as a member of the wider community, you can call it Western civilization or Judeo-Christian or whatever. So on both sides.
For many years, our only knowledge of the Bible came from the Bible itself. But modern archaeology has suggested a new approach, an attempt to understand the stories of the Bible in terms of their political, geographical, historical, and cultural contexts. What was at stake when the biblical text was put into writing was the invention of a lineage, the establishment of a law, and the affirmation of a messianic promise. All of that was linked to a book which, in exile, became a portable nation, a land that could be copied, studied, passed on, and celebrated. This day of the Jewish calendar is called Simchat Torah, the rejoicing of the Torah, or celebration of the book. As a result of events that were not foreseen by the protagonists, these pillars would become the foundation of Judaism. But that is another story.